The great nation of Nueva Granada, which has lived through a dramatic history full of glories and tragedies, lived in the 20th century. The brilliance of unparalleled politicians who left their mark on the national flag, of patriotic pride, but also of mourning and tears after its tragic end. We are referring in this case to the life and work of Jorge Eliécer Gaitán and Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, from the brutal murder of the first to the electoral theft against the second. These two men's lives were also Colombia's life. Victims of simplifications and distortions, today we are going to learn the lesser-told story of that 20th century Colombia. This is Reynaldo José Carrillo Vilches, and this is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to give us great support by liking this video and leaving your comments, which we always read. Turn on notifications with the bell, subscribe to the channel, and share this with all your contacts on WhatsApp, social media, and elsewhere. So, without anything else to add, let's start with today's story. Jorge Eliécer Gaitán was born in Bogotá on January 26, 1903, in the popular Las Cruces neighborhood. He was the son of Eliécer Gaitán Otalora, a radical liberal who, after working in different trades, finally dedicated himself to selling used books. His mother was Manuela Ayala de Gaitán, a schoolteacher, an active and progressive woman who left a deep mark on her son's upbringing. The Gaitán family had 6 children. Jorge Eliécer was the oldest. As for his father, although he was not as affectionate as his mother, he owned a bookstore that was a treasure trove of knowledge for Gaitán. From an early age, Gaitán was always very independent, very unruly. Due to financial difficulties, Gaitán's family soon moved to live in the Egipto neighborhood. He experienced that poverty himself. Sometimes, for example, he studied by the Capitol building's light in the corridors because his electricity was cut off at home. He also sometimes had to study by candlelight. All of that helped discipline him. At the age of 12, Gaitán enrolled in a school in Facatativá, finishing his primary studies in 1911. Only 2 years later was he able to resume his studies by enrolling at the Simón Araujo School, where the children of well-off liberals studied. It is important to note that since the mid-19th century, political life in Colombia was contested between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. Gaitán graduated from high school at the Martín Restrepo Mejía School, which he entered in the final year at the end of 1919. Gaitán was always restless and studious. His old library shows his thirst for knowledge. Writings from Marx and Engels to his own reports on the colonial era bore witness to his intellectual richness. He was not a wealthy man with Botero paintings in his office, like the prominent liberal Dr. Eduardo Santos. But he bought small prints of Greek and Roman paintings and sculptures, carefully displaying them in his study. All those humanist influences, like reading Plato and Aristotle, were shaping his character. Very different from the average contemporary, Gaitán was a politician who knew his country very well. In February 1920, he entered the Faculty of Law and Political Sciences at the National University, and 4 years later he obtained his law degree. With his controversial and very important thesis called Socialist Ideas in Colombia, Gaitán's first fundamental ideological element, we're talking about a 21-year-old young man who dared to write such a work in the context of 1924. Less than 2 centuries ago, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill were teaching the world about capitalism. Until 1917 with Vladimir Lenin, Marx's theses in the Communist Manifesto had not taken any political form. Gaitán draws from all of this and develops it, but at the same time he was influenced by positivism, whose vision distances him from any dogmatism. Gaitán understood Marxism as an analytical tool, as a way to analyze reality. but not as a political church, not with saints, apostles, and apostates. Unlike Marxism, Gaitán saw the economy as just one factor, not the sole determinant of everything. Just like ethnicity, religion, climate, sex, among other factors that influence but do not determine reality. Gaitán was politically active even as a student. He supported the coalition candidacy of the poet Guillermo Valencia in 1918, and he participated as a speaker in the protests against Marco Fidel Suarez. In March 1919, he received the important advice that Alfonso Villegas Restrepo gave to the young people of that time in the offices of his newspaper. He also organized the Rubén Darío Literary Society and established the University Liberal Center, which came to have some political influence. After this, he was elected to the Cundinamarca Assembly between 1924 and 1925. His early years of professional work were extremely difficult due to his social status. However, little by little, his brilliance earned him the recognition he deserved. He was part of the liberal student movement, which undermined the foundations of the conservative hegemony. With great effort, he managed to save money, and in July 1926, he traveled to Italy. At that time, fascism had already been established in Italy by Benito Mussolini. Would he take note of this for his future public speaking and mass politics? There he entered the Royal University of Rome, the most prestigious law school in that country, which was run by the Italian politician, criminologist, and sociologist Enrico Ferri, a world-renowned criminal lawyer where he earned his doctorate, received the Magna Cum Laude distinction and the Enrico Ferri Award, and it became a textbook in many places. It was titled The Positive Criterion of Premeditation. Gaitán returns to the country in 1928, a year that was intense both for the young lawyer's life and for the country's politics. He was elected as a representative to the chamber in March of that year, and in June, he led the demonstrations against administrative corruption. In addition to visiting the so-called Banana Zone in December, and this is a fundamental aspect that would mark his political career in the Banana Zone, he investigated the United Fruit Company workers' massacre, later fictionalized by Gabriel Garcia Marquez in 100 Years of Solitude. The Banana Massacre was an extremely decisive event in the political formation of Gaitán. The banana plantations were an economic enclave of the multinational United Fruit Company from the United States, with no economic relationship with the nation where they were located. This means that the American company did not pay taxes to Colombia or to the country where it was located. It also produced and exported the Cambur banana. It did not pay the workers' salaries in pesos, but in notes to be exchanged at the company's own stores. And under this logic, the workers did not feel free or entitled to rights. And that's why the banana workers' strike arose, the most important one of that period, due to repression by the national government, which with the army focused on defending the United Fruit Company's enclave rather than Colombian workers. Gaitán's denunciations before the Congress of the Republic about the serious events surrounding this company turned into open debates against the government of Miguel Abadia Mendez. In addition, many workers were released and compensation was paid to the families of those who had fallen. In this way, Gaitán emerged as an influential figure in the country's political life, thanks to his major debate on the issue of the banana companies. As a result of this event, Gaitán would go on to say that the land belongs to those who work it. He was the only politician at the time who dared to expose the abuses that financial capital was causing in important sectors of Colombia. The debate around the banana companies was precisely a debate against the United States and its imperialist policy. Let us recall the 1914 Urrutia-Thompson Treaty, when Colombia officially ceded Panama to the United States after Panama had been part of Colombia. since its creation. A treaty where Colombia got $25 million. This deeply hurt Gaitán and sparked popular opposition to giving this territory to outsiders. Gaitán also had to live through 1930, the end of the conservative hegemony in Colombia, with Miguel Abadia Méndez being the last president of half a century of conservative rule. Enrique Olaya Herrera, former United States ambassador under 2 conservative administrations, is about to become president, and who, as documented, was supported and imposed as a candidate by the United States to ensure American control over Colombian oil. All of this served as the foundation for Gaitán's rise as a national political figure. In 1931, with the liberals in power, Gaitán was elected president of the House of Representatives, president of the National Liberal Directorate, and second in line to the presidency. The next year, he became rector of the Universidad Libre. The timid reforms and slow social programs with which the new president, Olaya Herrera, thought he could get used to the partisan change in the government, seemed insufficient to the left-wing liberals. A group of disappointed people broke away from the Liberal Party in October 1933, led by Jorge Eliécer Gaitán and Carlos Arango Vélez. The so-called National Union of Revolutionary Left, or Unión Nacional de Izquierda Revolucionaria, for its initials in Spanish, was born. Outside the traditional bipartisan framework, this organization would be one of the most important political efforts in the country. The Unión Nacional de Izquierda Revolucionaria, with the slogan "Death to the Past, Revolution to the Present." It was especially influential among peasants in the coffee regions of Cundinamarca and northern Tolima, Caldas, and El Valle. In the first episodes of political unrest, the Cundinamarca Guard broke up a demonstration of Unión Nacional de Izquierda Revolucionaria, affiliated peasants led by Gaitán on February 4, 1934, by opening fire, leaving several peasants dead. A massacre occurred on August 14. In 1934, at the Tolima estate, in the jurisdiction of Ibagué, there was a workers' protest that had been influenced by the Unión Nacional de Izquierda Revolucionaria. Jorge Gaitán's party encouraged the principle of individual militancy and the registration of its members. Initially, there was an emphasis on strict discipline, including gymnastic exercises as basic military preparation. The organizations were not truly deliberative, and the general political direction of the party was the responsibility of the leader. The action platform of Unión Nacional de Izquierda Revolucionaria consisted of state intervention with a social approach in the economy, agrarian reform, and the organization of peasant cooperatives, an anti-imperialist nationalism regarding foreign policy, the constitutional reform that would give less prominence to the president, and social legislative reforms, including the creation of a social security bank, funded with mandatory contributions of up to 50% from large companies. Although the movement attracted supporters not only in the countryside but also among the workers of the emerging national industry, the tactics to weaken it proved effective. In the countryside, through repression, and in official liberal circles and the press, through silence and accusations that they were communists. Taking advantage of the leader's vanity and impatience, they managed to draw him back into the ranks of official liberalism. Even Jorge Eliécer Gaitán himself, who declared the Unión Nacional de Izquierda Revolucionaria dissolved in May 1935. A striking phenomenon is that part of the defeat of Unirism can be explained by the process known as the Revolution on the March, which began in 1934. In order to strip Gaitán of his social banners, the new president, Alfonso López Pumarejo, son of bankers and a banker himself. He himself undertakes a process of modernization of the state that serves to appease the growing social discontent and prevent Gaitán from coming to power, who had majority support among peasants and farmers. That's why the ruling class is going to decree labor rights, vacations, severance pay, and other reforms to prevent a social uprising. The right, for its part, gets scared by this so-called revolution on the march and elects Dr. Eduardo Santos as president, who puts a pause on this reform process. Then they elect López Pumarejo again, but he's not the same as during the revolution on the march since his government falls into decline and corruption. It is in this context that Gaitán decides to confront the official liberalism of his own party, thus giving rise to Gaitanist liberalism, which we will talk about later. Gaitán, then, is going to return to the Liberal Party to continue his political career, but always as a dissident. But why does he belong to a party while being a dissident? Because for him, the answer to the quasi-feudal thinking of the Conservative Party was found in the Liberal Party. Gaitán wasn't stupid. He was a dreamer with big ideas, but not an idealist. He wasn't going to stop because of his previous failures, because he had a holistic vision, meaning comprehensive and teleological, that is focused on the future.
And you know that those small minorities defend each other above their ideas to protect their interests against the interests of the working people, against the middle class and against the working class, against professionals and against intellectuals, against industrialists and against farmers. And what about the coffee growers who don't have a phone? About political influences that work the same for the voices of the conservative oligarchy as for the voices of the liberal oligarchy.
In 1936, Gaitán married Mrs. Amparo Jaramillo, and on June 8 of that year, he took office as mayor of Bogotá. As such, he carried out progressive work, although it was brief, since some rather extreme measures and pressure from the right forced him to leave the position. In February 1937, Mrs. Manuela Ayala passed away. The loss of his mother and his teacher was a hard blow for him, only eased by the birth, 7 months later, of his only daughter, named Gloria. After some international trips, Gaitán was elected as a justice of the Supreme Court in 1939, and the following year, President Eduardo Santos appointed him as Minister of Education. Then the debate about education takes place, and Gaitán sets out to take away the church's monopoly on education. That monopoly, by the way, was granted to the church, thanks to Dr. Rafael Núñez, who was the most important conservative politician in the history of Colombia. And we'll talk about him later. For Gaitán, education should be directed by the government, as well as being public and free. For him, education cannot be ideological indoctrination of any kind, neither right-wing nor left-wing, neither religious nor political. According to Gaitán, I quote, "Education must be scientific. We must and need to give all our support to high culture research and thought, but without forgetting, because of this, the different levels and groups of people who must be equipped with practical knowledge for the various tasks in the struggle of life. Gradations are essential and must be balanced in human knowledge, as I already said, not only taking into account individual abilities, but also the needs of social order. The government should not exercise ideological control. There has to be a diversity of orientations, and technical education should be promoted, since not everyone has to be a university doctor." He also adds that the dignity of teachers means they should be well paid, not with liquor. Gaitán held this position again for a short time. Among other achievements, he developed an ambitious plan against illiteracy and in favor of popularizing education and culture. Opposed to the re-election of the liberal López Pumarejo, Gaitán began an intense political career in 1941 that only ended with his assassination. He was a senator for Nariño in 1942, president of the Senate in September of that same year, and a presidential candidate opposing the official liberal Gabriel Turbay, creating the Gaitanist liberal movement. More than a traditional and structured socialism, Gaitán's movement was a populist kind of socialism, which is not the same as demagogic. Meanwhile, it sought to appeal to the interests of the large popular masses. He was disappointed with the Liberal Party, so he took his agrarian theses and decided to form his own party. The great debate about the agrarian problem comes, and Gaitán says the following: I believe that the agrarian problem in Colombia can be divided, for better study, into three aspects. First, uncultivated lands, which must be subdivided into two: those uncultivated with legitimate titles and those uncultivated with precarious or illegitimate titles. Second, cultivated lands with legitimate titles and cultivated lands with the illegitimate titles. Third, the relationships between human labor and agricultural capital. This may refer to either the first or second case listed and requires special study. Gaitán then goes on to say, if labor is the cause of that greater value, it is the worker who should fully benefit from it, and not the one who contributed nothing to the increase of that value. If it is labor that produces, let's pay the worker, let's give that tribute to the worker, and let's break away once and for all the idea that the owner should get everything, even if he makes no real effort, and that the worker only has the right to his meager wage. And finally, Gaitán adds, I believe the country must move toward the expropriation of all lands that are not being worked, with the sole exception of forest reserves previously designated by technical experts. My basic view is that all uncultivated land should become property of the nation. I am convinced that, as a result of this simple measure, vast areas of land will return to state ownership, and that they can be given after technical organization to the peasants free of charge. End quote. It should not be overlooked that this was one of his differences with the socialists in Congress. That's why Gaitán has never been able to fit into traditional molds, the left. Marx's position regarding capitalist land was that the state should nationalize it and lease it to capitalists. For Gaitán, it wasn't like that. The land should be distributed directly to the peasants and farmers. As expected, the official Liberal Party began its offensive against the Gaitanist movement. It was at that moment that Gaitán would say that the Colombian people do not have two parties, but rather that the people have been split in two so that the ruling classes can manipulate and domesticate them. Since the ruling class is just one, which, whether calling itself liberal or conservative, divides among themselves the highest positions in society, the land, and the banks of the country, while at the bottom, they set the people to fight in civil wars or electoral struggles. That was Gaitán's great political philosophy. At a time when television didn't exist, the voice was of utmost importance. It was the voice that communicated. A people who still hadn't finished learning to read and write at least knew how to listen. Gaitán used the radio to share his ideals with the people. He would go to Bolivar Square, where a huge radio drew crowds until the square was full. But the most important place where Gaitán connected with the masses was at the Municipal Theater of Bogotá, now renamed as Jorge Eliécer Gaitán Theater. As you would expect, the theater would also fill up completely with both students and people from the community. The people would go out and walk along Bogotá's 7th Avenue, and they wouldn't break a single window because Gaitán had his followers very well disciplined. Never again in the country were such massive demonstrations seen, nor with so much emotion and faith in their leader. These chants managed to express the feelings of the masses in a unique and original way. His variations in tone, his sense of humor and irony, the way he used pauses, made Gaitán an earthy orator who could be transformed by the emotion of what he said and how he said it, managing to transmit his feelings to the audience. It should not be overlooked that there comes a time when the liberal people truly become Gaitán-style liberals. Eduardo Santos will give the Liberal Party keys to Gaitán to take charge, then Santos goes to Paris. In the May 5, 1946 elections, conservative Mariano Espina Perez won with behind-the-scenes support from liberals like Santos and López Pumarejo. From those elections, Gaitán, for whom that contest was just another step toward power, came in third place with a surprising number of votes and with majority support from urban centers. Did these elections also serve for Gaitánism to take power within the Liberal Party and for him to be elected as the sole leader of his party? His social proposals such as tariff reform, banking reform, agrarian reform, and industrialization were announced at the Teatro Colón convention as the statutes of the Liberal Party, where it begins by saying that the Liberal Party is the party of the people. On January 18, 1947, and in August of that same year, they presented the failed Gaitán plan to Congress. Then the now legendary demonstrations took place, such as the Torch March, organized from the popular neighborhood of La Perseverancia, in which he wanted a river of fire. He didn't want to see lines every 3 meters, but rather lines close together to form a river of fire over Bogotá. And the overwhelming march of silence in which crowds, never seen before and perfectly organized, filled the traditional sectors of both parties with fear through their silence. The Conservative Party began to attack and organize the Chulabitas, a mob of fanatic conservative peasants who attacked and even killed liberals. Seeing the strengthening of Gaitanism, the conservatives López Pumarejo and Mariano Espina planned the fragmentation of the Liberal Party by supporting Gabriel Turbay as the Liberal Party's candidate for the upcoming presidential elections. According to Amparo Jaramillo, who was Gaitán's wife, Gaitán and Turbay met at Jorge Eliécer's house, where they had supposedly agreed that Gabriel would support Jorge Eliécer in these elections, and that Jorge Eliécer would support Gabriel in the next candidacy. However, the day after the meeting, Turbay called Gaitán to inform him that the pact was canceled because Dr. Santos would eventually support his own candidacy. It is said that Gaitán reacted angrily, but the Gaitanista movement continued, especially at that time when Gabriel Turbay decided to move to Paris. What will be done to consolidate the conservative government of Ospina Perez, a minority government? In other words, Gaitán's and Turbay's combined votes exceeded Ospina's. Well, unfortunately, institutional violence will begin in the life of Colombia. Alongside Mariano Ospina Perez's government and those of Laureano Gómez through Roberto Urdaneta Arbeláez. In 1953, when General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla led a military coup on June 13, Pinilla was placed in the presidency to disarm the guerrillas. Once this was done, they removed him in the same way they had put him in. Many historians consider the beginning of violence in Colombia to be April 9, 1948. But that's not true. It's just a historical fallacy. Gaitán presented the Memorial of Grievances in February 1947, listing deaths from government violence. He addressed it to the President of the Republic, and it was received by his Secretary General, Dr. Misael Pastrana Borrero, father of former President Andrés Pastrana. In this apparent regime of Colombian dynasties in which a few families hold political power, going back to the years of 1947, the violence started by the conservative government of Ospina. It will happen above all against Gaitanist liberalism, the only real alternative to power. With a serious and structured program, Gaitán will carry out the famous March of Silence on February 7, 1948, to denounce the growing violence against Gaitanist liberalism by members of the state security forces, as well as the Conservative Party and the government of Mariano Ospina Perez, which, by the way, was the largest in all of Colombia's history, with an attendance of 100,000 people gathered in Plaza de Bolívar. Delivering a speech of about 20 minutes, Gaitán said these words: "Mr. President, we ask you for something simple, for which speeches are unnecessary. We ask you to end the persecution by the authorities, and this immense crowd asks you the same. We ask you, both a small and a great thing, that political struggles take place for reasons of constitutionality. We ask you not to think that our calmness, this impressive calmness, is cowardice. We, Mr. President, are not cowards. We are descendants of the brave ones who destroyed tyrannies on this sacred ground. But are we capable, Mr. President, of sacrificing our lives to save the tranquility, peace, and freedom of Colombia?" How did the government respond to this? Even more violence. Then, at the Manizales Cemetery, on the 17th of that same month, Gaitán delivered the prayer for the humble. The answer: more Colombians dead. The following month, due to the government's uncontrollable violence, Gaitán broke the Liberal Party's ties with Ospina. By the express wish of Laureano Gómez, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gaitán was excluded from the 9th Pan-American Conference in Bogotá, which opened on March 13. That conference is key because, at the time, the United States positioned itself as the world's hegemonic power. After the end of World War II, the conflict between the ruling classes and the growing vigorous nationalist movement led by Gaitán became increasingly acute. A group of young Hispanic Americans arrived in Bogotá to organize the Anti-Pan American Conference. Among them was Fidel Castro, who at that time was not yet the representative of the Soviet Union we would come to know, but rather a nationalist member of the Cuban Orthodox Party. Castro asks him for a seat and visits Gaitán to discuss a series of topics, and he grants it to him for 2:30 in the afternoon on April 9th. That day, Gaitán secured one of his top victories as a criminal lawyer by getting Lieutenant Jesus Cortés acquitted. Around 1 in the afternoon on that April 9th, as he was leaving the building where he had his offices, Gaitán was shot with a revolver 3 times in the presence of some of his friends by a pale young man named Juan Roa Sierra, who had apparently been paid to kill him and who had come out of the Café Gato Negro. The news spread like wildfire. The young Sierra was caught and taken to the Granada drugstore to keep him cornered. One of those present asked him what his name was, to which he replied with his name. And then he says to him, "And why did you kill Dr. Gaitán?" To which he replies, "Because I was paid and there's a man accompanying me at the door." And he couldn't say anything else because at that moment the crowd broke through the gate to get in and took Roa Sierra to lynch him to death. The people decide to take the body of the supposed assassin and leave it as an act of protest. President's Palace. However, there are those who claim that the assassination of Gaitán must have been something very well planned. So the Roa Sierra they caught was actually just a random victim. And what about Gaitán? The people who were at the scene gathered around his body and picked him up to carry him on their shoulders to the central clinic. Meanwhile, the rest stayed behind cleaning the blood from that street, 7th Avenue and 13th Street in Bogotá. And it should be mentioned that at the time he was taken to the hospital, he had not yet died, but was injured and unconscious. A crowd gathered at the entrance until a doctor came out to inform them that despite all efforts, Dr. Gaitán had passed away. This was how the end of this leader's life was announced with few comparisons in American history. For his part, Fidel Castro had just finished lunch and went out for a walk, waiting for the time of his meeting with Gaitán. When he found out what had happened, he ran to the police station on 6th Avenue in Bogotá. The police had decided to rebel to defend the Gaitanist cause and handed out weapons to the people. The police in Colombia were, interestingly, municipal until that moment. Later, it would become a national police force, as it remains to this day. The assassination of Gaitán, since he had enough popular support at the time of his death to easily become president. It was the peak of the intense violence orchestrated by Mariano Ospina Pérez's government. Thus began its most terrifying day of death and destruction, Bogotá, and the intensification of the growing wave of violence that, with few breaks, the country would experience over the following decades. In Bogotá, the streets became a real battlefield between the deeply Gaitanista people and the Colombian army. The burning of the city was impressive. The people almost managed to take the San Carlos Palace where the presidency was located, which is now in the Casa de Nariño. But Bogotá was not the only city affected as uprisings broke out all over Colombia. In the name of the movement, or already of the Gaitanist revolution, the country entered a literal civil war. The death of Gaitán will lead to the birth of the liberal guerrillas, which would later mutate into the monstrous forms of criminal organizations like the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. They would shape the future not only of Colombia, but of the entire region. It's no exaggeration to say that on April 9, 1948, it marks a turning point in Colombia's history. And for that reason, Gaitán is the most influential and important Colombian of the entire 20th century. Gaitán's body is picked up by his wife from the central clinic at 3 a.m. the day after his death, through the place where they took out the trash directly to his house. She refused to let him lie in state at the capital until the Colombian government fell. Days later, on April 17, the government declared Gaitán's house a national monument. With that decree, and with no popular resistance left, they expropriated the political leader's house without making it look like it. With Amparo Jaramillo and Gloria Gaitán expelled from their home, Gaitán ended up being buried in his own house, which would now become a museum. The real motives behind Gaitán's assassination, as well as the ideology and political cause that were truly behind his figure. These are two topics of great relevance for the continent, which we will address in an upcoming video on this channel. Jorge Elias Gaitán had an anti-imperialist stance. He defended the nation's independence against any kind of foreign intervention, above the judgments that each person may form about his ideas. He was someone dedicated to defending workers and peasants, as well as defending national education, a scientific education, an education without interference from the government or the church, advanced and technical. He was a great orator, the greatest in the history of Colombia. He organized workers, formed unions, and started his own workers' federation. His vision of the economy, of society, of government, it was a democratic revolution, a change led by the workers, the peasants, the students, and the people. That's why official liberalism hated him. The death of Gaitán changed the country forever. The liberal guerrillas and the widespread anarchy would not have arisen if it hadn't been for his death. Colombian 20th century history is divided into before and after Gaitán. His legacy includes his speeches, ideas, political actions, and the Gaitán Plan. not so that they are copied today, but so that they are understood, reviewed, and updated for the contemporary world. His work is something that must be studied. Gustavo Rojas Pinilla was born on March 12, 1900 in the cold mountainous town of Tunja to a well-off family of conservative military men. He was the son of Julio Rojas Jimenez and Hermencia Pinilla Suarez and enjoyed a happy childhood with his 5 sisters. In Tunja, he finished primary and secondary school and was affectionately called Tatalo during those years. He would later highlight the pedagogical training he received as a child, because in his presidential and political speeches, he always expressed himself clearly and concisely, aiming for his ideas to be easily understood by the Colombian people. Since Colombia's independence as a republic, the country had gone through periods of peace and periods of intense conflict. The Conservative Party and the Liberal Party were competing for political dominance, and from 1886 to 1930, it was the conservatives who maintained control of the government and its institutions. Going back to the 1920s in Colombia, Gustavo Rojas Pinilla joined the military school at the age of 17 and had a brilliant military career, obtaining the rank of second lieutenant in 1920. His first military activities were carried out in the Tenerife Artillery Regiment in Medellin. In 1923, he joined the Ayacucho Infantry Regiment in Manizales as an aide to General Marco Alzate, father of Colombian politician Gilberto Alzate Avendaño, in the capital of Caldas, Colombia. Rojas Pinilla is promoted to Army Lieutenant, and in 1924, he requests permission to retire from active service in order to pursue civil engineering studies in the United States. In Indiana, he earned his civil engineering degree in 1927, and a year later, he participated in the construction of the important Belen-San Rojas Highway. Pinilla. He marries Carolina Correa Londoño, and they have 3 children, Gustavo, Emilio, and Maria Eugenia. These 3 children would inherit their father's taste for politics, especially Maria Eugenia Rojas, who later became a senator and presidential candidate in Colombia. By 1930, the liberals returned to power in Colombia, and a new era called the Liberal Republic began, which would last until 1930. In 1936, the Colombia-Peru War broke out due to territorial conflicts between Colombia and Peru. Because of this, Captain Gustavo Rojas Pinilla returned to the Colombian Army, being assigned to the Bogotá Artillery Group. He played a prominent role in that war, serving as commander of the coastal battery and as a military engineer for the region at the port of Buenaventura. Once the war was over, in 1936, Rojas Pinilla returned as an engineer in the technical department of the Army's munitions factory. He was sent to what was then National Socialist Germany. To secure resources for making munitions in Bogotá, he was appointed head of the technical department for munitions upon returning to Colombia. Pinilla remains active in the Army, earning a strong reputation in military circles during the World War II. Future President Gustavo Rojas Pinilla has been sent on an official mission. Year 1943 before the United States government to obtain weapons and materials for the military forces. There, he makes good contacts with influential figures in the United States. By 1945, Rojas Pinilla is appointed Director of Civil Aeronautics. In this role, he leads the Airstrips project in Colombia. This is his thesis for promotion to Army Colonel. It was in this thesis that Rojas outlined the renowned and future El Dorado Airport in Bogotá, whose construction would take place during his presidential term. Until then, our protagonists seem to have a peaceful military life, earning promotions without much trouble. However, in the year 1948, everything would change for Gustavo Rojas Pinilla. That year, Colombian leader Jorge Eliécer Gaitán was assassinated on April 9th. Gaitán had been a leader and spokesperson for the Liberal Party, whose charisma and social advocacy earned him a multitude of followers in the country. This raised suspicion in the Conservative Party, as well as among many traditional liberal leaders and the Colombian business community. As a result of his murder, strong protests and riots broke out in Bogotá, which later spread to other areas of Colombia. The military officer from Tunja, Rojas Pinilla, was sent to Cali to suppress the rebellion there. Thanks to his actions in pacifying the city of Cali and the Valle del Cauca, Rojas Pinilla received honors from the Department of Valle and from the government of President Mariano Ospina Pérez Rojas. He would later say that his work in Cali had been the best of his military career. Pinilla already enjoyed great prestige in the army, but thanks to his distinctive peacekeeping actions in Cali, he gradually earned the definitive recognition and trust of several high-ranking political and military leaders. On October 11, 1949, Pinilla was promoted to general, and on October 18, he was given command of the Brigade of Military Institutes. On December 3, 1949, Rojas assumed his first high-ranking civil political position when President Ospina appointed him as Minister of Post and Telegraphs. Still, Rojas Pinilla's shining moment would have to wait. The assassination of Gaitán would leave deep consequences in the South American country, marking the beginning of the period historians call La Violencia, after fierce clashes between the government and protesters after Gaitán's death. A part of the liberal leadership ordered its members to take up arms against the government, which had been taken over by the conservatives in 1946. This led to a kind of small war in Colombia between 1948 after Gaitán's death and 1958 with liberal and communist guerrillas fighting against the National Army and the National Police, as well as conservative paramilitary groups such as the Chulavitas, the Pajeros, and the so-called conservative peace guerrillas. It was a decade marked by homicides, assaults, fights, persecution, massacres, and property destruction. At the heart of this period of violence was the struggle for power between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, as well as the internal struggles between their factions. After the Bogotazo, Conservative President Luis Mariano Ospina escaped unharmed and increased repression against dissent. Because of the levels of violence, the Liberal Party does not participate in the 1950 presidential elections and calls for the government to be disregarded. This clears the way for the conservative Laureano Gómez to win the presidential position that same year. On the side of Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, after his outstanding fight against the liberal uprisings, the general is appointed as Colombia's delegate to the Supreme Command of the United Nations military forces in Washington. A year later, in 1950, after continuing to show excellent performance and keep gaining the trust of several political and military leaders, Rojas Pinilla achieves the peak of his military career when acting President Dr. Robert Urdaneta Arboleda appoints him General Commander of Colombia's armed forces. Now, during the early 1950s, in the decade of violence, the conflicts of violent and political disputes had increased in intensity, and there was no political solution that could resolve it. In the early years of the 1950s, the worst numbers of deaths and violence of this entire period were recorded. Neither the state forces nor the liberal and communist armed groups had any intention of giving in. At the same time, a crisis of governance was developing, where numerous political factions did not recognize the government institutions or the call made by the government. A constituent assembly in 1953. Faced with this situation of anarchy, and at one of the most violent moments of 1953, General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, along with various groups, made a decision that would mark his life and this stage of Colombia. After a period of deliberations and reflections, in the face of a society that was crying out for peace, a group of military officers led by Rojas Pinilla decided in June of 1953 to depose the conservative president Roberto Urdaneta. Carrying out a peaceful coup d'etat without bloodshed, the group of military officers offered the presidency to various renowned politicians, and after they refused, General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla assumed the presidency. Gustavo Rojas Pinilla's coup was welcomed by much of the population and the political class. He had the support of former presidents and leaders from both parties. He also had the support of the armed forces and the national police. The new government of Gustavo Rojas Pinilla presented itself as a nationalist Christian movement. His program was based on a discourse of peace, justice, and freedom, of order against anarchy and moral crisis, of patriotism and nationalism, to achieve cohesion and restoration. According to Rojas Pinilla, it was not possible to achieve peace without social justice that benefited the poorest. The new president said, "The country cannot live in peace while it has children who are hungry and naked." So Rojas focused his government on restoring public peace, the implementation of social reforms for the most disadvantaged, and the promotion of economic development, employment, and a major infrastructure plan. Something that's not calm, hunger, nakedness, the president calm, hunger, and nakedness. Something that's not with the country, calm, children hungry, nakedness, something. Under Rojas Pinilla, the strengthening of the state and Colombian society was proposed, based on the social doctrine of the Catholic Church and on the ideals of the liberator, Simon Bolivar. Thus, the government of Rojas began with the complex challenge of pacifying the country at a time of the greatest excesses of inequality, decade of violence. To achieve this, he offered amnesty to guerrilla fighters who laid down their arms and economic reconstruction for the areas most affected by the violence. This, combined with military deterrence tactics, led a significant group of guerrillas during his administration to eventually lay down their arms, but some others continued to rise up against the government. During the nation's stabilization, Rojas Pinilla confronted many guerrilla groups with state weapons. At the same time, the Communist Party was banned and demonstrations were suppressed, especially the 1954 massacre of 11 students. Rojas also maintained a regular confrontation with the press, with most newspapers controlled by his opponents and several even having ties to armed guerrillas. Several newspapers were closed during his administration. Over time, with Rojas's policies, the clashes and conflicts of the period, known as La Violencia, decreased considerably. But Rojas couldn't completely quell them, and violence remained present in Colombian life. In addition to protests over what were called excessive uses of government force, Rojas started his term with strong bipartisan support. But as he began to build his own political force, supported by workers, the middle class, and the military, the parties gradually withdrew their support. When one of his ministers announces the creation of the Popular Action Movement. To support Rojas Pinilla, the liberal and conservative parties begin a strong opposition against Rojas, but we'll come back to this later. Rojas Pinilla placed a strong emphasis on social policy. During his government, practical and technological popular education was strengthened, as well as education with new agricultural technologies and popular culture. Additionally, the social assistance network was expanded to better support the most disadvantaged with food, services, and health. Rojas Pinilla promoted the radio school programs of Zutatenza, and during his government launched an innovative regional initiative called Educational Television. Used television to help educate young people. During his term, television was also introduced in the country, and urban and rural telephony was automated to strengthen communications. For Rojas Pinilla, popular culture should not be stimulated with rudimentary means, but by taking advantage of the most advanced technological means. Television, radio, theater, printing, and all the means to use them for the cultural elevation of the masses. Likewise, during Rojas's time, numerous schools, colleges, and universities were created in the Neo-Granadine territory. On his side, during his government, a significant infrastructure and industry plan was carried out, with the following projects standing out among them: the completion of the Atlantic Railroad, the paving of most of the country's main highways, The creation of the National Training Service, the People's Bank, the Livestock Bank, as well as the building. The construction of El Dorado Airport in Bogota and the start of construction of 18 more airports was of special significance. In the same way, aqueducts, sewers, avenues, and roads were built, and different regions of Colombia were electrified. During his administration, the Acherías Paz del Rio steel mill, the Chinquinquirá milk plant, and the military hospital were completed. At the same time, the hydroelectric dam was completed. A new refinery was built in Barranca Bermeja. The Bogota-Chía Highway, the National Administrative Center, the Military Club, and the Astronomical Observatory were built, among many other projects. Another very popular measure by Rojas Pinilla to this day was being the first president of Colombia to grant political rights to women. This was a revolutionary event in the South American subcontinent, as it made the Colombian nation one of the first to govern. Women's right to vote? Another important aspect of his social policy was the creation of the institution, National Secretariat of Social Assistance, that is, the National Secretariat of Social Assistance, which was led by his daughter, Maria Eugenia Rojas de Moreno. National Secretariat of Social Assistance sponsored popular markets, Christmas gifts for poor children, school cafeterias, daycare centers, and created social welfare centers in cities and rural areas. In turn, Rojas Pinilla also developed popular housing, the rural house, rural insurance, and the employment exchange, in addition to carrying out numerous social works for the victims of violence. Another very striking aspect was his foreign policy. He had a complicated relationship with several South American leaders, especially Venezuelan counterpart Marcos Pérez Jiménez, marked by ambiguities, while his relations with the United States were similar to those of American companies in the exploitation of Colombian resources. Even though violence had decreased and the government was making progress in reducing poverty and ensuring greater institutional order, political clashes and conflicts continued in the country, along with various student protests. In 1954, Rojas Pinilla had been re-elected by the Constituent Assembly, and by 1957 he was seeking to be re-elected once again. Although Rojas Pinilla's 1953 coup was initially applauded, his government later became problematic for various internal and external interests in Colombia. When Rojas shows that he would form his own political base, the conservatives and liberals turn against him. In 1956, conservatives and liberals improved dialogue, reconciled, and formed a bipartisan pact, now united in their opposition to Rojas. The United States also withdrew support for Rojas and closed international credit lines to his government in 1957. Political conflict intensified when a new Constituent Assembly announced the upcoming re-election of Rojas, and the opposition leader, Guillermo León Valencia, was arrested. Rojas's opponents, who had long plotted to oust him, escalated protests, strikes, work stoppages, and military negotiations. After several days of civil strikes and having lost the support of the United States as well as part of the army and the church, Rojas decided to announce his resignation on May 10, 1957, leaving a military government junta in power. This military junta focused on taking steps to allow the country to transition to new governments. Of those registered in the bipartisan agreement known as the National Front, between 1958 and 1959, the National Front government put the Pinilla military government on trial. General Rojas Pinilla appears before the Senate to defend himself against the accusations made against him. The verdict of the National Congress on March 18, 1959, was a conviction against General Rojas. However, 7 years later, the Superior Court of Cundinamarca restores his political rights. And in October 1959, a year later, the Supreme Court of Justice confirms this judicial act. As a result of this ruling, Rojas Pinilla and his associates are allowed to found the National Popular Alliance movement, a party based on the patriotic and nationalist ideals of Rojas Pinilla. And it also allows people from different ideologies to join the alliance, turning it into a party with sectors ranging from the left to the right. The National Popular Alliance movement, led by Rojas Pinilla, takes part in the 1968 legislative elections, even with a somewhat improvised and troubled campaign. They get 16% of the votes, making them the third most voted party in the country, behind the liberals and conservatives. Thanks to these election results, Rojas Pinilla begins to emerge as a candidate with a serious chance of winning the presidential elections. And the ruling class of the time begins to look unfavorably on this aspiration. Against him were the press, the traditional political parties, and the national government, since on one occasion President Lares Restrepo declared in a speech the need to defeat Rojas in the elections. This was considered a violation of the president's impartiality during election times. The truth is that the elections were held and turned out to be quite close, giving 51% of the votes to Pastrana and 49% of the votes to Rojas Pinilla. However, Rojas Pinilla and his supporters opposed the official results, calling them fraudulent and questioning their validity. In response to this situation, the 19th of April guerrilla movement emerged, arguing that if power could not be obtained through an electoral process, it would be taken by force. Later, this movement gained international attention after the Palace of Justice takeover, which resulted in the deaths of 11 justices and over a dozen others. However, Rojas Pinilla did not live to see this event that would mark the history of his country, as he died of a heart attack at his estate in Melgar. On January 17, 1975, his burial was in Bogota, where he lay in state at the national capital. In this way, this controversial stage of Colombian history came to an end, which for the first time so clearly broke with the endless struggle between conservatives and liberals. His political views see patriotism as ensuring a union of Colombian-style conservative socialism and a strong market, of the search for social justice, peace, and help for the needy and disadvantaged, without neglecting economic progress and social development. These were the pillars with which he tried to guide his government until he was overthrown by the usual interests in less than 4 years. To tell the story of the 1970 electoral fraud in Colombia, it is necessary to take a look at the last 2 decades of Colombian political life. What about Gustavo Rojas Pinilla? The 1950s in Colombia began with the political and social consequences of the assassination of Jorge Eliécer Gaitán on April 9, 1948. Gaitán had been a controversial popular leader who, with his ideas and actions, had challenged the interests of various political and economic groups that conspired to carry out his assassination. After Gaitán's death, social order broke down and a small civil war erupted, known as the period of La Violencia. La Violencia, in which amid great social instability and political unrest, guerrillas from various factions, liberals, communists, and conservatives, fought against each other. Among each other and against the National Army, they left a long, bloody trail of death, homicides, disappearances, and torture. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, which had historically been the dominant forces fighting for power in Colombia, continued that same struggle. During this violent period, conservative Laureano Gómez won the 1950 elections, and a year later handed over the presidency to Roberto Urdaneta Arbeláez. However, he was unable to put a stop to the violence, which was growing uncontrollably and resulting in alarming numbers of fatalities. At that time, Gustavo Rojas Pinilla was a renowned military officer with undeniable intellectual and professional training, close to several key figures of the era, such as the clergy and the armed forces to which he belonged, political elements from both the liberal and conservative parties. At the same time, he had shown brilliant skill in handling the riots that had resulted from the Bogotazo in the city of Cali and the Department of Valle del Cauca. In this way, after a long series of promotions throughout his career, Rojas Pinilla was eventually appointed by President Arbeláez as the Commander General of the Armed Forces of Colombia in 1952, having the entire military apparatus of the country in the palm of his hand, which, together with the political apparatus, was the only force capable of stopping the rampant violence and political instability of the time. As a result, during this situation on June 13, 1953, Rojas Pinilla and other members of the military leadership, along with the support of key sectors of Colombian power, peacefully deposed President Arbeláez. They ultimately give power to the man who gained the most consensus among the conspirators, General Rojas Pinilla, who for this coup d'etat and at the beginning of his government had the approval not only of the vast majority of the population, but also of the political class. That is, from important members of the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, as well as former presidents, businessmen, and members of the clergy. In this sense, the government of Rojas Pinilla, framed within what they themselves called a Christian nationalist ideology, was characterized by several themes. On one hand, the exhaustive fight against the guerrilla in search of stabilizing and pacifying the country, which eventually led to a significant cessation of violence in the region. Of course, it couldn't eliminate it entirely. On the other hand, his period witnessed a palpable economic and social development. This was shown in part by building industrial complexes at several key points nationwide. The paving of roads, the stimulation of agriculture and livestock, and the multiplication of development banks, and a major public works plan that included the large-scale construction of government buildings, entire housing developments, electrification of towns and villages, sewage systems, airports, and other public works of vital importance to the nation. Another essential aspect of Rojas Pinilla's government was attention to social issues under the banner of what the government called social justice, promoting a major social assistance plan for the most disadvantaged using public resources, as well as the use of the latest technologies, such as television, for the education of the youngest and the masses. Women's suffrage is also approved. Popular housing programs are promoted. Social assistance is formalized along with the enactment of laws and decrees that improve the condition of workers in the popular classes. All of this earned Rojas Pinilla significant popularity and his own political base, separate from the traditional parties and embodying his own movement, what would eventually become the party known as the Popular Action Movement, which, along with the church and the army, were the main pillars of Rojas Pinilla's government, which was not part of the traditional circles of Colombian political history. As Rojas Pinilla rose and established himself as an independent figure, distanced from the dominant parties, these same groups that validated Pinilla's rise to the head of state gradually withdrew their support until they became his staunchest opponents. Mainly, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party set aside their differences and joined together in a common cause to overthrow Pinilla and to enter into talks with other key political figures to bring about his downfall. Thus, after long months of protests, strikes, and work stoppages sponsored by the Liberal and Conservative parties, as well as international pressure joined by these same parties from the United States, which, among other things, suspended credit lines to Colombia. As a result, key support from the armed forces and even the clergy was eventually lost. These factors caused Rojas Pinilla to announce his resignation on May 10, 1957, leaving for exile outside of Colombia. After his resignation, Rojas Pinilla leaves power in the hands of a military junta, under which the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party officially form what had already existed unofficially, the so-called National Front, a bipartisan pact in which both political forces agree to alternate in power, excluding any other party or alternative that might threaten their leadership. Thus, the first government of the National Front, presided over by Alberto Lleras Camargo, summons Rojas Pinilla at the end of 1958 for a criminal trial. Rojas Pinilla attends and defends himself, but the government, alleging a supposed plot by the former president, imposes a state of siege for more than a month in Colombia, and finally it declares political disqualification for Pinilla in March 1959. Despite this, Rojas Pinilla founded the National Popular Alliance Party, called National Popular Alliance in 1961 based on the same nationalist, Christian, and popular ideas of his government. However, for the time being, the party does not manage to take off, but it remains active in national politics. Politics during the government of the bipartisan National Front, although it maintained relative economic stability, ultimately was not able to contain the guerrilla violence that broke out again after the years of stability under Pinilla, resulting in a large number of displaced people and deaths due to conflicts between armed political factions. As a result, new discontent arose against the National Front status quo. This created a favorable situation for the party of Rojas Pinilla, who was beginning to emerge as a strong presidential candidate. In 1968, surprisingly, the Supreme Court of Justice once again enabled Rojas Pinilla to hold public office. And in that same year, the National Alliance managed to win some seats in the Colombian House of Representatives. Thus, by 1970, Rojas Pinilla continued to gain popularity. Once again, with a modest but effective campaign that highlighted the stability and development achieved during his years as a leader. And emphasis was placed on the social justice policies and popular policies directed toward workers during his administration. In addition to strong criticism of the National Front's ineffectiveness in dealing with guerrilla violence, presidential elections were scheduled for April 19, 1970, and Rojas Pinilla had become a leading candidate to beat. However, Rojas Pinilla again unsettled the National Front, forcing them to mobilize fully. This included both the traditional parties, most of the press, and even the national government itself. In a desperate show of support for Rojas Pinilla's rival candidate, who was Misael Pastrana Borrero, the National Front, it should be noted, found itself in serious trouble. Furthermore, because internal dissent began to arise within the very parties that were part of this historic pact. Such was the case of Baristos Ortiz and Belisario Betancourt, dissenters from the Conservative Party, which greatly reduced the party's support for Pastrana. A sign of this alarmism within the National Front was their fear of losing their monopoly on power in Colombia. This is shown by the unusual event when President Lleras Camargo gave a speech emphasizing the need to defeat Pinilla in the presidential elections. This was seen as a violation of the political impartiality that is expected from the office of the president during an election period. Thus, Election Day arrived on April 19, 1970. All predictions pointed to a close, but almost certain victory for Pinilla in the race. The voting took place nationwide with a surprising peace and civility that did not seem typical of a country deeply divided by bipartisanship and intimidated by violence. As night fell, as was customary, radio stations reported the results much faster than the National Registry, and all radio bulletins declared Gustavo Rojas Pinilla the winner, with a lead of 113,000 votes over his opponent, Misael Pastrana. However, suddenly, the Minister of the Interior, Carlos Augusto Noriega, orders the radio stations to stop broadcasting the electoral bulletins, and he demands that they refrain from publishing results other than those that will be released by the National Registry Office. This decision is confirmed and enforced by the Minister of Communications, Antonio Diaz Garcia, halting the publication of the bulletins and plunging the population into a long period of uncertainty. Only radio bulletins are banned. Minister Noriega announces a preliminary bulletin in which Rojas Pinilla was ahead of Pastrana but by a smaller margin than the initial 113,000 votes that the radio stations had reported. However, by the morning of April 20, the day after the elections, the government issues the official bulletin, in which, surprisingly and under astonished, incredulous, and some displeased looks while others were pleased, Pastrana defeated Pinilla by 63,557 votes. The reaction was immediate. Rojas Pinilla and a large part of his party denounced to the national and foreign press an electoral fraud in Colombia. This fraud is denounced due to vote-counting irregularities in several departments, such as Nariño, Sucre, Cauca, and Choco. In Nariño, radio stations reported Pinilla had 36,126 votes, but by April 20, the official count dropped to 28,938. In Sucre, Pinilla had also received nearly 12,000 votes in radio bulletins on election night, but by the next morning he ended up with less than 8,000 in the official results. As for Cauca and El Choco, Pastrana's votes increased dramatically, but they justified it by saying that those were votes that had come from the most remote municipalities. The complaints about this fraud, however, were not heard by the government or the public authorities. Instead, they quickly validated the results. In this sense, a more radical faction of the National Popular Alliance Party declared armed rebellion. At the same time, a large part of the population poured into the streets in protest. This led to several violent clashes and reignited the conflict between the various political and armed groups in the country. The government skillfully took advantage of this situation, quickly declaring a curfew and a state of emergency, and places Rojas Pinilla under house arrest. Meanwhile, it orders imprisonment for members of the National Popular Alliance Party who were taken to military bases. The state of siege lasts a little over a month and is finally lifted on May 15th. Enough time for the government to quell the riots and handle the allegations of fraud, which, despite not stopping, were drowned out by the government's indifference and by the press that was hostile to Rojas Pinilla. Over time, Rojas Pinilla, now over 70, gradually stopped pursuing his rightful victory, or at least that an effective vote recount would occur. It seemed that Rojas Pinilla was resigned to accept the ostracism and ridicule to which he had been subjected by the National Front and the press, and he was bitterly accepting the blatant fraud. In this sense, little by little, he began to distance himself from politics, and he spent his last years on his farm in Melgar, in the department of Tolima, where he died at the age of 74 on January 17, 1975, due to a heart attack. As for the National Popular Alliance Party, the Pacific Wing was lost in the corrupt political machinery of the National Front, which blocked any significant participation until its final dissolution, caused by internal conflicts, plus the external veto in 1998. For its part, the armed wing and other leftist factions of the party rose up as a result of the electoral fraud and led to the formation of the April 19th movement, or simply M19, which created a new ideological line based on Rojas's political foundation, and which carried out a large number of controversial and violent operations that contributed to lengthening the list of homicides and disappearances in Colombia's armed conflict. For a long time in Colombia, there was debate about whether or not there had really been fraud, but the confirmation of this comes from the minister himself, Carlos Augusto Noriega. 20 years later, in 1998, when in a book he wrote titled The Fraud in Pastrana's Election, Burrito, he repeatedly confirms there was manipulation in the results and that it was taken from Gustavo Rojas. Pinilla, his clean victory. Pinilla's first government left a tangible result of political stabilization, economic and social progress, important public works, and civic and moral education. And it was precisely the possibility of taking up these causes again in a new government term that was taken away from the Colombian people that early morning in April 1970 The fraud committed in that election in Colombia is a stark example of the reality behind some so-called democratic systems, which under the promise of representing the interests of the majority, end up perpetuating the rule of a few, only this time under the disguise of the popular will. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and your support truly helps us. By engaging with the channel, commenting, liking videos, and sharing content on social media, WhatsApp, or elsewhere, and by activating the bell so you get notifications every time we publish new content. So thank you all again, and may God bless you.